I should have known things were going to spiral out of control the moment Karen showed up in my driveway with a clipboard, a walkie-talkie, and a whistle around her neck like she was running drills for the neighborhood Olympics. "Step away from the paint roller," she shrieked. "This is a visual crime against humanity." I was halfway through painting the front of my new home, a peaceful eggshell blue, when she launched into a breathless tirade about community guidelines and optical decency. 15 minutes later, a white SUV pulled up, complete with flashing orange lights and magnetic decals that read HOA Rapid Response Enforcement Unit. Out jumped 3 people in matching polos and cargo pants, armed with measuring tapes, clipboards, and expressions like they were storming a meth lab. That was my official welcome to the neighborhood. Just 2 weeks earlier, I'd closed on the house after leaving the chaos of city life behind. I wanted a quieter pace, a big yard, maybe a garden if I didn't kill everything with my brown thumb. The neighborhood was nestled in a sleepy cul-de-sac, and the house, though structurally sound, looked like it had been dipped in beige and left to dry in 1992. The siding was faded, and the trim looked like it had been chewed by squirrels on meth. So naturally, as someone with functioning eyeballs, I planned to repaint. I chose a calm, modern blue with crisp white trim. Not neon, not psychedelic. Just nice. A couple of days before I started, an older gentleman from down the street named Bert stopped by. "Just a heads up," he said, eyes darting around like we were under surveillance. "Karen's the HOA president. She's enthusiastic." I asked if there were any actual rules about paint color. He gave a shrug and said, "There's a handbook, but nobody reads it. Karen just kind of makes things up as she goes." That would have been my first red flag, but I was still in new home bliss and figured I could handle one nosy neighbor. The first morning I painted, everything felt normal. I had a podcast in my ears, paint on my elbows, and a cold lemonade on the porch. That all shattered around noon when Karen materialized like a Disney villain whose power came from solar panels and passive aggression. She didn't knock. She didn't say hello. She stormed across my lawn, waving a laminated sheet and demanding I stop defacing our community's architectural spirit. I thought she was joking. I laughed. That was a mistake. She glared at me like I'd just confessed to arson. "You clearly didn't submit a form for exterior modification. This color is not in the pre-approved visual palette." I replied that I hadn't seen any such palette and asked if she could show it to me. She pulled a binder from her tote bag, opened it to a page labeled Historical Neighborhood Integrity, and pointed to a list of 8 approved colors, all of which could be described as oatmeal. I told her, with measured calm, that I hadn't joined the HOA yet and hadn't agreed to any rules. That's when she got on her walkie-talkie and said, "Dispatch, we have a violation in progress. Deploy rapid response." I genuinely thought she was bluffing, until the HOA SWAT team showed up. They weren't actual law enforcement, of course. Just 3 hired goons who looked like they took mall security too seriously. One tried to measure the surface area of my wall with a laser pointer. Another photographed my paint cans like they were smuggling contraband. They informed me I'd be fined $500 per day until the illegal paint was removed. I told them they were welcome to leave my property before I started charging them rent. That evening, I found a bright red violation notice taped to my front door. It was signed in thick marker, "Karen, HOA President." The notice cited unsanctioned exterior alteration, aesthetic destabilization, and community disunity. It was so absurd I genuinely thought it might be satire. I framed it and hung it in my garage. The next day, I finished painting. Mostly because I was too stubborn not to. I'd paid for the supplies, the weather was perfect, and I refused to be bullied by someone who dressed like a Sunday school traffic warden. But as I worked, I noticed more and more neighbors slowing their cars, peeking out blinds, and whispering to each other. Some gave thumbs up. Others shook their heads like I was installing a nightclub. Then came the drone. Yes, Karen had a drone. It buzzed over my property, hovering like a tiny judge in the sky. I grabbed my garden hose and gave it a casual spritz. It buzzed away sputtering, and I smiled like a man who just told a telemarketer he'd call the cop. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from a random number. You have 24 hours to repaint. Consider this your final warning. HOA enforcement. I replied with a selfie next to my freshly painted house captioned, "Blue looks great, doesn't it?" Then came the real escalation. A formal notice, delivered by certified mail, summoned me to an emergency HOA hearing. The reason: violation of aesthetic harmony, willful defiance of authority, and incitement of civil unrest. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the envelope. But the more I thought about it, the less funny it became. Because Karen wasn't just power-tripping, she was rallying support. And if I didn't push back soon, she'd paint me into a corner. Figuratively. And maybe literally. So I started digging. Into the HOA bylaws, the state ordinances, and Karen's own history of power grabs. I wasn't just going to win. I was going to win so thoroughly that the color blue would become a permanent scar on her little beige empire. The emergency HOA hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday evening in the community clubhouse, aka a beige shoebox with folding chairs and stale coffee. I arrived 15 minutes early, not because I was eager, but because I wanted to see Karen squirm when I walked in with a smile. I wore a navy blue shirt on purpose, a not-so-subtle jab at the supposed visual destabilization I was causing. The room was already half full. Neighbors I hadn't even met were seated in tight rows, whispering behind their hands. At the front sat the HOA board. 5 people who looked like they were chosen from a casting call for retired jury duty. And in the middle, of course, was Karen, perched like a gargoyle over a binder the size of a microwave. When she saw me, her nostrils flared like a horse about to charge. I gave her a casual wave and took a seat in the second row, directly in front of the board. Karen stood, tapped the mic twice for dramatic effect, and launched into a monologue so passionate I thought she might break into song. She cited clauses I'd never heard of, referenced fictional design codes, and even quoted the Geneva Convention at one point. Something about how the color blue could be considered psychological warfare under certain lighting conditions. The woman should have been a playwright. Or committed. Then she pulled out the visuals. A slideshow titled The Paint Menace began playing on the cheap projector, complete with slow zoom-ins of my house, dramatic black and white filters, and ominous background music, probably something free and spooky from a YouTube library. Each slide had captions like "Disharmony in Suburbia" and "A Threat to Neighborhood Serenity." I swear one of the slides showed a melting polar bear with the words, "This is what happens when you ignore HOA standards." When it was my turn to speak, I walked up with a single manila folder and cleared my throat. First off, thank you for the terrifying PowerPoint. I'll treasure the image of my house causing a penguin to cry for the rest of my life. A few people in the crowd chuckled, but Karen glared like she was mentally repainting me out of existence. I continued, explaining that I hadn't signed any HOA agreement when I purchased the house. I presented a copy of the deed, the title documents, and a certified letter from my real estate attorney confirming the HOA's jurisdiction technically didn't extend to my specific lot. You could hear a pin drop. The board members looked at each other, clearly thrown. Karen leapt from her chair. That's a lie. He's in violation of the revised Visual Continuity Clause, Article 4, Section 8. I held up a page from the county's zoning map with a highlighted border. Actually, Karen, this entire street was annexed after the HOA was established. My property isn't covered by your rules. And that clause you just shouted? Doesn't exist. She stammered something about neighborhood cohesion and stormed off to a side room to consult legal documents. The board dismissed the meeting 10 minutes later with no action taken. I walked out victorious, or so I thought. The next morning, I found a fresh stack of flyers under my doormat, duct taped to my mailbox and pinned to a tree stump. They read, "Warning, house at 1143, Pine Ridge Lane IS, and unapproved structure. It included a phone number to report visual offenses, and a photo of me holding a paintbrush with a photoshopped caption that read, "Known HOA Violator." I picked one up and chuckled. Known HOA Violator sounded like a punk rock album. I was half tempted to print shirts. Things got more absurd by the hour. Karen had started a campaign to protect the community's visual soul. She stood at the cul-de-sac entrance every afternoon handing out pamphlets. She even organized a protest one Saturday. I came out to mow my lawn and found 8 people in matching khaki shirts standing on the curb holding signs that said things like, "Blue isn't neutral," and "Paint with pride, not rebellion." One guy had a megaphone and was chanting something that sounded vaguely like a cult hymn. I offered them lemonade. They declined. That same weekend, I got my first official HOA fine. It was delivered by hand, by Karen herself, of course, and cited me for landscaping incongruity. The fine was $200, due in 48 hours. The charge? My grass was allegedly too green and in sharp contrast to the community's muted tones. I stared at the paper, then back at Karen, and asked her if she'd like me to spray paint it beige. She responded by taking a photo of my bushes. I assumed she was building her next PowerPoint. I knew it was time to fight smart. So I started documenting everything. Every fine. Every flyer. Every unhinged conversation. I even installed a camera on my front porch and captured video of Karen peeking into my windows and pacing my lawn with a tape measure at 11 p.m. I stored all of it in a folder labeled Operation HOA Karen. And then I made a call. Remember Bert, the older neighbor who warned me early on? Turns out Bert wasn't just a retired insurance agent. He used to be a city code inspector. When I told him what was happening, he almost spit out his coffee. "She's pulling violations out of her yoga pants," he said. "None of that's enforceable." Bert introduced me to his niece, who happened to be a real estate lawyer with a mean streak for HOA abuse cases. She loved the drama. When I sent her the video of Karen's midnight lawn inspections, she responded, "Let's bury her in paperwork." While the lawyer prepped the cease and desist letter, Karen doubled down. That's when she introduced the piece de resistance, the HOA Enforcement Task Force. A brand new initiative she proudly announced via email blast and an official-looking banner draped across the clubhouse. HOA SWAT Swift Watch for Architectural Transgressions. And yes, she spelled it out in big bold letters. SWAT. The email promised a mobile response unit to monitor for non-compliant visual elements and enforce rapid restoration. Preserving our identity, one color at a time, the tagline read. I figured she'd just guilt-trip some teenagers into walking around with clipboards. I was wrong. 2 days later, a white panel van with flashing amber lights pulled into my driveway. Painted on the side, in blocky letters, was HOA SWAT Enforcement. Out popped 3 people wearing navy polos and sunglasses like they were in an off-brand reality show about neighborhood justice. One had a GoPro. One had a walkie-talkie the size of a brick. And one, God help me, had a drone in his backpack. Karen wasn't with them, but she was definitely the puppet master. They began walking the perimeter of my home like they were prepping for a raid. I walked outside holding a sandwich. "Y'all gonna paint the house or just gawk at it?" I asked. The guy with the GoPro started filming. "This is HOA enforcement," he said seriously, like he was on cops. "You're in violation of municipal compliance regulations." I laughed. "Which ones?" He blinked. The standard ones." I chewed my sandwich slowly. "That's not a thing. They didn't like that. They tried to hand me another fine. I refused to take it. They left it in my mailbox, which I later learned was a federal offense. I made a note. The van drove off, but not before the drone guy launched his quadcopter and started scanning my yard like he was looking for contraband. That night, I sent a formal complaint to the city attorney's office. I attached footage, emails, and a full list of Karen's antics. I also included a request to audit the HOA's financials, specifically asking about the budget behind this SWAT team. The next morning, I got a call. The city was very interested. Karen had just escalated things from annoying to illegal. And I was done playing defense. The gloves were off. The documents were filed. And it was time to hit her right where it hurt, her precious HOA bylaws. Because I wasn't just going to win this fight, I was going to make sure she'd never be able to color code anyone's life ever again. By the time the HOA SWAT van made its third appearance on my street, this time with Rapid Aesthetic Response Unit stenciled in Comic Sans, I had enough evidence to start a Netflix docuseries. Their mission that day? To photograph my porch chairs. Apparently, they were non-conforming in hue and contour. One guy squatted down and stared at them like they were radioactive artifacts, while another poked my flower pots with a yardstick. The GoPro guy was back, narrating the ordeal like some kind of suburban crocodile hunter. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so wildly, dangerously unhinged. Karen was nowhere in sight, but her fingerprints were all over this farce. What she didn't realize, because narcissists never do, is that while she'd been busy playing tyrant with my patio furniture, I'd been playing chess. With each violation, each mailer, and each drone pass over my home, I was collecting ammunition. Not just for a cease and desist letter. I was building a full-blown case. Thanks to Bert's niece, I'd already filed an injunction request with the city, citing abuse of HOA authority, misuse of funds, and harassment. But that wasn't enough. I needed to know how Karen was affording all this madness. The custom polos. The ridiculous banners. The freaking drone unit. A tip from another neighbor led me to a discovery that nearly made me spit coffee all over my laptop. Karen had been tapping into the HOA's reserve fund, meant for emergency infrastructure repairs, to finance her enforcement squad. That included printing flyers, paying the so-called response unit, and even purchasing a community surveillance drone that was legally operating without permit or license. I obtained the HOA's quarterly financial report, after 3 formal requests and 1 threat of legal action. It was a disaster. Buried under vague line items like neighborhood security enhancements and visual response tools were invoices from a local security company owned by, drumroll, Karen's cousin. A company that had been paid over $15,000 in just 2 months. Suddenly, the cartoonishly incompetent SWAT guys made sense. They weren't professionals. They were family hires. Armed with this discovery, I filed an ethics complaint with the City Housing Authority. I also dropped a copy of the financial summary, highlighted, annotated, and tabbed, into the mailboxes of every homeowner in the neighborhood. That lit the match. Within days, my quiet street exploded with tension. Neighbors who had previously stayed quiet now came forward with their own Karen horror stories. One woman said Karen fined her $250 because her dog's collar clashed with her shutters. Another admitted she was too scared to hang holiday lights after Karen randomly measured their lumen output. Bert confirmed that 2 families had sold their homes just to get away from her constant fines and threat. Then came the emergency HOA town hall. The clubhouse was packed this time, standing room only. Karen sat at the front table, flanked by her board members like a dictator with nervous lieutenants. When someone asked if she was using HOA money to pay her cousin's security firm, she tried to deflect with a ramble about neighborhood protection and visual unity. I stood and calmly read excerpts from the invoices. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was ice cold. Karen snapped. "This is warfare," she screamed. "He's undermining the community. He's poisoning the neighborhood spirit." "No," I replied. "I'm just reading the receipts." Her voice cracked. "You're destroying everything we've built." I leaned forward and asked, "Everything you've built, or everything you've siphoned?" The meeting devolved into shouting. Karen stormed out. Half the board looked like they wanted to crawl into the floorboards. The homeowners were furious. And yet, nothing changed. The HOA didn't disband. The fines didn't stop. Karen doubled down. That very weekend, a bright orange sign appeared in my yard overnight. Under Community Review, Non-Compliant Structure. It looked official, but it was laminated cardboard duct-taped to my garden gnome. Subtlety had clearly left the building. That's when I decided it was time to flip the game board completely. I filed a lawsuit, not just against Karen, but against the HOA itself. Harassment, trespassing, defamation, illegal drone surveillance, improper use of funds, abuse of governance. Bert's niece, now my lawyer of record, filed the paperwork with gleeful precision. She also served an emergency restraining order against Karen and her SWAT crew, preventing them from setting foot on my property. Karen, ever the drama queen, responded with her own counter-lawsuit the very next day, claiming emotional distress, community endangerment, and what she described as willful incitement of residential chaos. She represented herself. Of course, the court date was set for 3 weeks out. But in true Karen fashion, she didn't wait for legal due process. One morning I caught her pacing the sidewalk in front of my home, speaking loudly on her phone, clearly for the benefit of nearby neighbors. "I just don't feel safe anymore," she said. "It's the psychological impact of living next to that house. It's like living beside a lighthouse during a migraine." I opened my window. "Do you want me to install a dimmer switch?" She huffed and stormed away. The week before the trial, I received an unexpected visitor, a city zoning inspector. Not to fine me, but to investigate Karen. Apparently, she'd filed a formal complaint with the zoning board that my home was out of compliance with historical district color palettes. "Problem is, we don't have a historical district." The inspector chuckled as he looked over my paint job. "Looks nice to me. Better than the HOA's beige monopoly." He also mentioned something interesting. Karen had filed over 50 separate complaints in the past year. All rejected. All against different neighbors. That gave me another idea. I filed a public records request and obtained the list of complaints Karen had submitted to the city over the last 2 years. It was comical. She'd filed complaints for wind chimes being too melodic, garage doors that open too loudly, and garden gnomes that resemble political figures. She'd even submitted a 12-page letter about aggressive hummingbirds disrupting the peace near her backyard. I compiled the most ridiculous ones into a binder and titled it, The Karen Files. And I brought it to court. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Neighbors showed up in solidarity. Bert wore a Paint with Pride button. Karen arrived in a white suit, clutching a briefcase and a stack of crumpled papers. She tried to open with an emotional statement about how my blue house had led to 3 separate anxiety attacks and 2 fainting spells. The judge asked for medical documentation. She said her spiritual therapist could provide a letter. Then my lawyer took over. We laid out everything. The faked violations, the phantom bylaws, the illegal spending, the surveillance, the harassment, the nepotism. We showed drone footage. We played audio clip. We passed around HOA financials marked with glaring red flags. And then, for dramatic effect, I handed the judge the Karen Files. A full anthology of her neighborhood madness. Karen's jaw was clenched the whole time. At one point she tried to object, claiming I was committing emotional terrorism via visual medium. The judge asked her to sit down. But the real moment came at the end of the hearing. I stood up and said, "Your Honor, I think it's important to note that I didn't come here to win an argument about paint. I came here to stop a pattern of abuse. No one should be fined for enjoying their home. No one should be harassed because their siding isn't the right shade of oatmeal. This isn't about a color. It's about control." The judge nodded, took a breath, and said, "I'll issue a ruling within the week." As we left the courthouse, Karen shoved past me, muttering something about appealing to the Supreme Court. But deep down, she knew. The war was ending. And this time, beige was outmatched. The ruling came down 5 days later in a thick envelope with the court's seal stamped right across the front. I didn't even open it on the porch. I brought it inside, made myself a cup of coffee, and read it slowly at the kitchen table like I was savoring the ending to a very long, very absurd novel. As expected, the court found the HOA, and Karen specifically, guilty of multiple counts of harassment, trespassing, and unauthorized surveillance. The SWAT enforcement scheme was deemed a gross misuse of HOA funds and a violation of several city ordinances. The court ordered a full audit of the HOA's finances, all active fines nullified, and a restraining order against Karen extended for 12 months. But the best part was tucked near the end. The judge wrote, in an almost sarcastically polite tone, that my house color was neither visually offensive nor in conflict with the broader neighborhood aesthetic, which is notably diverse in both hue and architectural spirit. In short, the court officially approved my blue house. Legally, publicly, permanently. Karen could protest all she wanted, but the law now said my house was beautiful. I made a copy of that page and taped it to my window. Then I printed another one and hand-delivered it to Karen's mailbox. I could have stopped there. I could have taken the win and moved on with my life. But I'd spent months dealing with her nonsense, months of lies, manipulation, and drone warfare. And I still had one last card to play. What Karen didn't know, and what I hadn't told anyone except my lawyer, was that I wasn't just a victim in this circus. I also happened to serve on the State Zoning Oversight Committee, an appointed position I'd taken the year before when I moved out of the city. I'd mostly used it to rubber stamp park benches and sign off on new sidewalk code. But now I was going to use it for something far more satisfying. You see, while digging through HOA paperwork, my lawyer discovered something strange. Karen's HOA was operating under a charter that had technically expired 2 years ago. When a homeowners association fails to renew its incorporation with the state and doesn't update its bylaws to comply with modern zoning code revisions, it loses its legal authority to enforce new regulations. In other words, Karen's little empire? It was built on an expired foundation. I called in a review hearing through the zoning committee. As a member, I had the right to challenge outdated or non-compliant homeowner organizations, and I brought receipts. I presented the court transcripts, the invoices, the rogue enforcement team fiasco, and of course, the drone footage. The board members, seasoned bureaucrats who'd seen every zoning abuse in the book, were appalled. By the end of my presentation, one of them muttered, "I thought HOA horror stories were exaggerated." Guess not. The vote was unanimous. Effective immediately, Karen's HOA was stripped of its enforcement authority until further notice. No new fines, no new enforcement actions, no drone patrols, and no mandatory aesthetic standards could be issued. Their funding would be frozen pending full investigation. Now here's where it got good. I waited until the next HOA meeting to reveal this. The clubhouse was full again. Karen, unaware of the review hearing, had resumed her role like nothing had happened. She was standing at the podium giving a speech about restoring order when I walked in, handed a folder to each board member, and said, "You may want to read this before we continue." Karen glanced at the packet, smirked, and scoffed. "Another amateur legal stunt?" "No," I said, "an official state zoning ruling. Your authority is suspended." One of the board members looked up, pale. "Karen, is this true?" She flipped through the pages, trying to spin it, but it was all there in black and white. Expired charter, illegal enforcement activity, violation of multiple city and state statute. A hush fell over the room as people began reading. And then came the moment that made all the months of absurdity worth it. Karen exploded. "You think you can come into my neighborhood and ruin everything?" she shrieked. "You think a coat of paint makes you some kind of hero? I built this community. I defined its character." "No," I said calmly. "You bullied people, broke the law, and wasted everyone's money. You didn't build anything. You just bossed people around until they stopped pushing back." Her eyes narrowed. "This isn't over." I smiled. Oh, I know. You still have to face the city's finance investigation. Good luck explaining those invoices from your cousin. At that, she stormed out of the meeting, knocking over a folding chair on the way. I stayed behind and answered questions. Most people were shocked by what I revealed. A few were angry. But the overwhelming reaction? Relief. The Karen era was over. In the weeks that followed, things began to change. The HOA board, now under immense pressure, voted to suspend all enforcement actions until legal reviews were complete. Neighbors who had been hiding their flower pots, repainting their fences, or removing tasteful decorations out of fear started restoring their homes. One guy put up a 30-foot inflatable flamingo on his lawn as a joke. Nobody stopped him. Karen, on the other hand, tried everything. She filed an appeal with the state zoning office. Rejected. She contacted the local news. They ran a story, but not the one she wanted. The headline read, HOA president suspended after drone surveillance and color crackdown. The accompanying photo was Karen mid-scream, red in the face, holding her infamous binder. It went semi-viral. She became a meme in 3 local Facebook groups. Eventually, she filed a personal lawsuit against me for emotional damages and reputational harm. The judge tossed it in under 5 minutes. He said, and I quote, Ms. Karen, being disliked for abusing your neighbors is not the same as being defamed. I thought that would be the end of it, but one final twist remained. Turns out, Karen had been collecting compliance contributions from residents for years, essentially HOA dues charged without proper disclosure. The city finance audit found tens of thousands in unrecorded transactions, many paid in cash. Some of it traced back to that same cousin's fake security firm. When the city issued their report, they forwarded it to the district attorney. Karen was indicted for fraud. The news broke quietly at first, then snowballed. She tried to spin it as a political hit job, but nobody bought it. Her voice, once loud and all-consuming, faded from the neighborhood entirely. She stopped showing up at meetings. Her house went up for sale. Rumor has it she tried to move into a new subdivision, but they had a strict, no HOA involvement clause that she couldn't stomach. The community, once trapped under her tyrannical color wheel, breathed freely again. One neighbor painted their shutters bright yellow. Another installed purple lawn gnomes. No one said a word. As for me, I repainted the house. Not because I had to, but because I could. This time I added a deep navy trim. Just a little nod to the absurd war I'd won with patience, paperwork, and paint. And one last thing. Remember that HOA SWAT van? After Karen skipped town, it was impounded and auctioned off as part of the fraud investigation. I bought it. Had it repainted, of course, bright electric blue, with bold lettering across the side that reads, Neighborhood Watchdog, sponsored by Common Sense. Every once in a while, I drive it around the block, just for laughs. The neighbors love it. There's a quiet power in watching a neighborhood breathe again. Not literally, of course, although after months of Karen-induced claustrophobia, it really did feel like people were taking full breaths for the first time in years. Lawns bloomed in eccentric shades of green and gold. Mailboxes once stripped of personality now flaunted hand-painted designs and wind chimes. The community Karen once controlled like a puppet show had finally snipped the strings, and I, somehow, had become the accidental symbol of that freedom. After her indictment, Karen vanished. Her car disappeared from the driveway, the blinds in her windows stayed closed, and the mailbox that once overflowed with HOA notices now gathered dust. Eventually, her house was listed quietly through a private realty firm, but not quietly enough. Half the neighborhood shared the listing online with sarcastic captions like, haunted by bylaws, and warning, property may be aggressively beige. She never showed up to her own final hearing. The city finalized the charges: misappropriation of funds, misuse of a non-profit charter, unlawful surveillance, and a handful of minor offenses that added up to a major embarrassment. Her cousin's security company was exposed for what it was: A two-man operation run out of a garage, using HOA money to buy khakis and clipboards. Karen's exit wasn't dramatic. No final showdown. No last act of revenge. It was almost anticlimactic. Like the villain of a long movie who simply forgot which door led out and walked straight into obscurity. But as satisfying as her downfall was, my mission hadn't truly ended. The HOA was still technically intact. Disarmed, yes, but alive. And if there's one thing HOA structures are good at, it's regenerating bad ideas. So I ran for HOA president. It wasn't even supposed to be serious. A few neighbors joked about writing me in on the ballot. I told them if elected, my first act would be to declare every Friday Gnome Appreciation Day. Apparently, people liked that. A month later, I was elected with 92% of the vote. Karen got one write-in. She wasn't even a resident anymore. With power finally in sane hands, I began undoing the madness Karen had baked into the HOA charter. First, I dismantled the arbitrary color restrictions and replaced them with a single clause: use common sense. Next, I refunded all fines issued under Karen's regime using recovered HOA funds. Then I set up an online voting system so residents could approve or deny future changes, rather than rely on 5 board members with superiority complexes. I also hired an independent financial advisor to oversee the HOA budget. For the first time in years, every expense was publicly posted online with receipts and full transparency. No more mysterious maintenance charges. No more emergency drone line items. And as promised, I officially instituted Gnome Fridays. Residents were encouraged to decorate their lawns with the most ridiculous, creative, or downright disturbing gnomes they could find. Bert showed up week 1 with a life-sized gnome wearing sunglasses and holding a tiny garden beer stein. Someone else installed a gnome dressed as a flamingo. Another one had gnomes reenacting The Godfather on their front porch. The whole thing turned into a contest with small prizes. Karen would have had a stroke. But beneath all the humor and absurdity, something real had shifted. People who had once lived in fear of Karen's clipboard now laughed in front yards together. Neighbors who never spoke now organized barbecues, driveway concerts, even a community mural on a formerly forbidden brick wall. It wasn't just about a house color anymore. It was about reclaiming the idea of community from the grip of authoritarian absurdity. The mural, by the way, included a small panel dedicated to my blue house. Someone painted it under the title, "The Color That Started a War." Beneath it was a tiny caricature of me holding a paint roller like a sword. I didn't ask for it, but I admit, it made me laugh harder than anything in months. And yet, there was still one itch left unscratched. I wanted to visit Karen. Not out of revenge. Not even for closure. I just needed to see her face one last time, needed to know that she knew the monster she created had been dismantled, not with rage, but with law and laughter. So, I found her. Well, sort of. I tracked down her new neighborhood about 30 miles away. No HOA. A sleepy row of rental houses near the county line. I didn't go to her door. That would have been petty. Instead, I parked across the street and watched from my car for a few minutes. She came outside to collect her mail. Her hair was different. She looked thinner, quieter. Less like a dictator, more like someone just trying to disappear. She glanced around nervously, probably wondering if any mailboxes were 2 inches too tall or if the grass violated some imaginary regulation. She didn't recognize me. Or maybe she pretended not to. Either way, I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. I'd won. Not just the case. Not just the paint war. I'd changed the entire system that gave her power. And in the process, I'd built something stronger than rules. I'd built trust. Driving back, I passed a sign for a newly forming HOA development. Big bold letters promised order, security, and uniform beauty. I laughed out loud and kept driving. Back home, I pulled into the driveway and looked at my house. That perfect eggshell blue shimmered in the sunset. The white trim popped. A wind chime gently swayed above the door. And my garden gnome, painted gold and holding a tiny legal gavel, stood proudly in the flower bed. That night we hosted a block party. People spilled into the street with lawn chairs, grills, and music. Kids rode scooters up and down the sidewalk, their parents no longer afraid of receiving citations for noise violations. A neighbor brought out a karaoke machine. Someone else made Karen cupcakes, lemon-flavored with a little fondant clipboard on top. Halfway through the night, a new family moved in down the street. They were unloading boxes when one of the board members approached them with a welcome gift, a small bottle of wine, a flower pot, and a note that read, "There are no color codes here. Just neighbors. Welcome home." The woman looked stunned. "Really? No restrictions?" "Only one," the board member said, smiling. "Don't be a Karen." Laughter erupted. Even I couldn't help but raise a glass. Later that week, I received a letter from the city zoning office. They wanted to thank me for exposing procedural abuse and restoring civic balance in residential governance. The phrasing made it sound like I'd led a revolution, which, in a weird way, I had. Enclosed was an honorary certificate. I taped it next to my court ruling in the window. If Karen ever passed by, I wanted her to see the full gallery of blue justice. Weeks turned into months. The HOA became a kind of legend, still active, still organized, but governed by humor and transparency instead of rules and fear. We voted on actual improvements now. A dog park, a free little library, neighborhood Wi-Fi. Real projects, real benefits. Nobody ever mentioned the color of anyone's garage door again. And that blue house? It became a landmark. Realtors began referencing it in listings. 2 blocks from the famous HOA house that took down Karen. I didn't mind. If my home had to be famous for something, it might as well be for standing its ground against tyrants in khaki. Every now and then, people still stop by. Some to ask about the story. Others just to take a picture. I always smile and wave. And if they ask for advice, I tell them the same thing every time. Paint your house whatever color you want. Just make sure you've got a good lawyer and a better sense of humor. Because when the clipboard warriors come for you, there's no stronger weapon than knowing the rules, and being willing to rewrite them if they're broken. And that's how a simple can of blue paint ended a reign, dismantled a dictatorship, and turned a neighborhood into a family. All it took was a brush, a binder, and a little faith in common sense.